Hello, folks. I'm here a little bit early, like last time, but that's okay. Just to confirm some items. Technically, we'll get started in about 5 minutes here on Unfound Ground, on the ground number 12. I'm putting in the chat the disclaimer, which I'll be reading is per usual anyway. But like last time, I wanted to get this there in text. Chat 2. Bear with me. We'll have some folks joining us in the next 5 minutes. So we're here for Unfound on the Ground number 12, an overview of missing persons legislation. We'll recap that shortly here. So we have some folks joining us. Again, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll begin. We have our new formatting, and I am broadcasting. Welcome, Delane. Broadcasting. This time I won't say an undisclosed location. I'm back in North Dakota. Hello. I'm back in North Dakota. I'll keep the rest undisclosed, although some of you know I live in the western side of the state. And we're utilizing this new formatting. Again, we were being, myself, I, Ed, Natasha, and the rest of the team, being responsive to feedback, doing some reflection based on that. So shifting the formatting, the previous episode using this formatting went live, went public recently. And so that's out there. Again, please continue to share these links and so forth. Again, we have a few more minutes. We have a few minutes. And I am also going to post the Isaac trial. I have not been closely. Kathy, hello. I have not been, but there's many things I need to catch up on. We're at about 2 minutes, folks. Thanks to you joining us now. And in 2 minutes, I'll do the usual beginning protocols, but we have begun a little different than we were using Zoom. Here, we're here. Hello again, Kathy. Hello again to everyone. This time, and again, always trying to get better and more comprehensive, both on email and on Facebook, the guiding questions. And I know we can't always be ready for every question. We're covering so many good topics. Hello, Linda. And we'll get started in a minute. Hope everyone's doing great. And moving forth, whatever you need to in life. We hope to, great, Kathy, outstanding. And from now on, I'll be sure not to continue to put those in both email and on Facebook and so forth. So we're getting close to starting time here officially. We've already begun the stream, so this is all being recorded. Again, thanks to Natasha for her work. Thanks to the entire team. Of course, Ed is the boss, but we are moving forward. This is Unfound on the Ground number 12. I'll catch up on the chat here in a second. I'm going through the usual disclaimers. This is Unfound on the Ground number 12, an overview of missing persons legislation. This episode will be recorded, video and audio, including the text chat. Chat participation is an option for the journalistic, promotional, and/or commercial purposes of Unfound. The audio and video recording, including text chat of this digital meeting, will be distributed by Unfound. By participating in this digital meeting, you agree to give Unfound permission to use the rendering of your words for journalistic, promotional, and/or commercial purposes with no compensation to you from Unfound, its assistants, its affiliates, its partners, etc. Welcome, folks. As always, we're back. Let me, this time, actually publicize the Data Gems link. Again, this is an outstanding resource. Way behind still, not because of Natasha, but because of me. However, the good news is, starting with the previous episode, using this YouTube platform, I'm able to do some or a significant amount of quote-unquote real-time sharing of some of the resources in the chat. Those also do appear in the when this is which is public. But again, we will continue to update that. The Data Gems continues to be an outstanding resource anyway. I'm Eric Grabowski. Many of you know me. Some of you who join or who eventually watch may not, especially if you're new to Unfound on the Ground. The Unfoundpodcast.com, the Unfoundpodcast.com. That is the website for the platform, the framework of Unfound, primarily guided by the episodes and all sorts of other great material. Again, we're thankful to the think tank folks for participating in these Unfound on the Ground sessions, giving us feedback, and so forth. Continue to share your topic ideas with me or Ed. We have more episodes coming up, probably about one a month. And so we're always cogitating on ideas. I am a member of Unfound's assisting team there with Ed. I've been a guest on Unfound, and in academia, I am involved in the teaching and study of communication, and I do some cold case journalism on the side. As always, my usual disclaimer that my viewpoints here tonight do not necessarily reflect those of my employing university. As always, feel free to give your own disclaimers if you feel you need to. Again, we're always striving for things, items to discuss that support the overall mission and identity of Unfound. We're striving for accuracy. We're striving for thoroughness. We're striving for, to the extent possible, in supporting robust public discourse, justice, and so forth. Again, as always, I'm not a lawyer, and we're not looking to give legal advice, although certainly tonight we are discussing legislation. Now, like always, we're not going to get to everything. There's so much. It's hard, in some ways, very difficult to get one's head around. Probably tonight, too, won't be covering much on the international side. Maybe that'll be a separate episode. Like many of what we cover, plan someday to do a follow-up because there's just so much. Another thing I realized, and we kind of knew this before, and we've talked about various organizations that have great resources, but the more you look into some of the legislation side, you begin to see or get reminded of a range of organizations. So maybe someday having an episode that's tied to organizations out there might be a good idea. Keep in mind, as we talk about politics tonight, we're not getting political in over the top. That's not the right word. In the way in which we're going to, in a sense, cross some of the boundaries that we tried to avoid. Although we are dealing with political matters. And although we are talking about advocacy and awareness in a general sense, most of my focus tonight will be legislation that's already passed. Now, we will or might uncover some issues of possible additional or ongoing legislation. And let's keep in mind, too, that notwithstanding one's political point of view, as I always say, even as we as a group and those who watch this sort of have a broad general commitment to the awareness of missing persons cases and the prioritization of those things to assist in helping to solve missing persons cases, and by the way, to prevent people from going missing. Let's also recognize that when you're dealing with policy and legislation at the local, state, and federal level, that you can have authentic disagreements about nuances and practicality. But the reality is there are a number of items or pieces of legislation that we could cover. I will, like last time, try to do some real-time sharing. Again, and let me also say, as always, there's some items here certainly that Ed and Natasha and the team have contributed to sort of the broader big picture or synthesis of material for this episode. So let me start. First of all, okay, so one of the guiding questions, sort of the lead guiding question is there a specific piece of legislation that you wanted to discuss? Keep in mind that what we're talking about tonight is for the generally the United States of America. Obviously, federal and state legislation is what you're going to tend to see. There are 50 states. There are 50 states in the union, and certainly a range of aspects of state law. I have some examples. You might too. Obviously, there are federal matters and legislation to consider. So when we talk about missing persons legislation that you want to feature, anything along those lines. And again, we are focusing on things generally that have been passed. I'm not saying not to mention something that you might think could be a good idea. We might, again, there will be some issues that are out there that certainly when you talk about coordinating resources and raising awareness, that those are important considerations. And maybe we could say, in terms of civility and in terms of good government, again, notwithstanding one's political views, maybe missing persons legislation and so forth could be an area of some legitimate common ground for people to come together. And certainly that has been the case. So let me just put that out there before I jump into a few items to get us started. I know you might have varying knowledge on this, and what you mentioned I may have planned already. There may be things that we note for the future and might even become specific episodes. So Delane mentioned something very important: legislation for missing and murdered Indigenous people. That has been, as we know, through various media sources, an area of greater awareness, as it should be, for all people. And so that is certainly something that we want to keep on our horizon is important. And we know that awareness is out there, and rightly so. In terms of publicity, focus, and resource allocation, and who knows, maybe a future episode could get more specific on tribal communities and beyond. Kathy mentions, I could only find that missing persons legislation was governed by state law. Interestingly, although we'll see certain federal laws, of course, there are a number of aspects, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but soaking this up, there are aspects of state law, certainly, that necessarily need to be in place. Also, too, although there are federal laws that provide mandates and or guidelines, there are times, depending on the law, there are times when states have to navigate some of their own ways in terms of what they're doing. So obviously one area of ongoing policy consideration would be the issue of coordinating information, resources, and so forth. It's difficult to find to keep up on everything, and in a way, Delane, that's not a bad thing, because hey, we all develop our own areas of focus, right? And that's okay. That's why we're a community here under the Unfound banner. So let me give an example here. And this is actually one that Natasha mentioned to me. And so in Tennessee, we have the Holly Bobo Act. And I'm just putting out there now, again, a reference to that for your reference. And this is right off the Tennessee General Assembly website. Expands the Bureau's Endangered Child and Young Adult Alert Program to include persons under 21 years of age. Okay, so some of us know about the Amber Alert framework, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Certainly states have other sorts of alert systems too. And if you notice, if you go on the federal resources, you'll see that the general policy or guideline for Amber Alert is generally 17 years of age or younger. However, in certain states, you'll see either for Amber Alert that age a little bit different, or other age groups might fall under another sort of alert framework, sort of an endangered framework. Here you can see in Florida, at least as of the page that I've just shared, they have 18 listed. Also, too, in Ohio, you can see here that 18 years of age is listed. Okay, I'm in Ohio there. I just shared that. And you'll see, as with Ohio and other states, there are other notification systems too. Okay, look, I got North Dakota here, and this seems to be current. That has 17 years of age. Okay, we could go on and on there. Get to know what's going on in your own state. Okay, but with the Holly Bobo law, you talk about the issue of tools, the Holly Bobo Act. And so, we talk about success, and Natasha mentioned too, when we talk about impact or success, there was a piece here, some material from some news organizations in another case, right? This search for Daphne Westbrook, and I'm not going to get into every detail here as I share the resource. Now, she eventually was found, but you'll see in the discussion how that act is discussed as helpful for getting the word out about this missing person. So, with that act, it enabled Tennessee to change the age for an endangered notification. Now, doesn't seem to be necessarily what we'd think is the specific Amber Alert, although I could be wrong, but their endangered notification system. Now, again, different states have different criteria for that, and we need to continue to look into that for sure. Know your own state in terms of what those laws are, what those policies are, for sure. Okay. Okay, and here is, and this looks to be, again, there's the Endangered Alert Holly Bobo Act. You can see on this page some of and this is what I'm going to sense here is from Tennessee, so in context how that works, right? So even if it's not necessarily an Amber Alert, right, there are other sorts of alerts that could be helpful. There's an example. Has anyone I got that, it was Natasha that suggested that to me as a good example. Has anyone heard of this Holly Bobo Act or anything similar? And you can see on those resources I've shared sort of the information and timeline there in terms of the legislation, and then in examples provided as to how that could be helpful. Is anyone familiar with this law or any similar laws or acts or legislative pieces of legislation in any other states? Okay, so that's a resource for you, for sure. And I provided some of the references there for you. Anyone have any other acts they want, or acts or laws? Let's just go legislation, right? Acts or laws. These things affect policy and resource allocation, and obviously coordination of law enforcement, either by mandate and or recommendation, depending on that federal state dynamic. Anyone have anyone they want to share before I keep moving here? And I have, as always, references for us to deal with. Okay, so let me keep going here. And I want to talk about, and there's some good resources out there. And one of the questions that came up that was, where are some, again, USA.gov. I've mentioned that before. There's a search framework on there. That's one, in terms of federal and state resources. But even there, you have to do some sifting, and you see some cross-referencing. And so I want to mention here, and this we've mentioned in previous episodes, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Yeah, Suzanne's Law, Lyndon. We're going to that's one we're covering for sure. So appreciate that mention. One good resource here, and we've looked at this the IACP.org site before, International Association of Chiefs of Police, and this document they have pertaining to missing persons that we've mentioned before. They have an overview if you scroll down to around page 10, and there's also another site that we'll discuss along these lines. But if you go through this, you'll see sort of an overview of pieces of legislation, some of which has international, and there is some international mentioning there. They cite missingkids.org, which we've talked about before. There are some resources on that site. But domestically, you see federally various acts that go back in time. Missing Children Act, 1982, Missing Children's Assistance Act, 1984. Hey, here, the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act, 1994. Okay, and so there we're starting to get into coordinating issues of registration, sexual offense, particularly tied to children. As we look at some of these pieces of legislation, obviously these are relevant to missing persons. This is relevant to prevention and solving. It's also relevant to sort of larger discussions about crime that would involve missing persons, and particularly children, although certainly we're thinking about missing persons in general. But a lot of the legislation, as this document I think indicates, do understandably so focus on children. There's the Protect Act of 2003, which we'll mention a little bit more possibly here. That's the prosecutorial remedies and other tools to end the exploitation of children today, Protect Act 2003, right, which involves a number of items pertaining to Suzanne's Law. There's national coordination of Amber Alert programming, which had been in place, but it puts more coordination on the table of that. It develops the Code Adam program in terms of dealing with public buildings in terms of locating missing children. and then it does some other things, as you'll see there. Of course, we got the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006, which we'll talk more about. Of course, the idea of Amber Alerts continues to come up. So this is a good resource. There's a range of overview here. I have another one that I want to mention, and that here, and let me go back to the, and so on the Hope 4, the number 4, the missing.org, they have an article. It's a pretty good overview of the resources and provisions of these various laws going back in time. And I'm going to pull this up. And, if you look at this from a historical perspective, in this article, of course, it takes us back to 1932 with the passage of the Federal Kidnapping Act. And then you'll see there's a timeline on there. And, of course, some of these acts we're familiar with. But you can see that over time, with expanding awareness and questions of resource allocation, that there's areas of focus, even as technology continues to, quote unquote, go forward, in the ways in which we need to not just utilize technology to solve cases or even to enact prevention, but also the ways in which technology can be risky, and to be aware of that in terms of prevention and awareness of missing persons cases. Again, particularly children, although, and again, that's where the much of the legislation, though not all of it, has pertained. 1990, passage of the National Child Search Assistance Act. That's another key one. Again, there's a 1984, an establishment for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Okay, we know that's a tremendous resource. We've talked about the Protect Act 2003. Again, the Walsh Act 2006. That's an important one, and so forth. So that's a good one, a good overview there, thinking about that. In that particular article that I just shared, there's a lot of resources mentioned in there in terms of that pertain to the either the establishment or the implementation of some of these pieces of legislation. So, keeping that forward, and we're going to get to Suzanne's Law and the Suzanne Lyle Campus Safety Act here specifically. I want to stop here and say, has anyone here ever advocated or been a part of this sort of work at your state level, local level, or federal level in terms of promoting any of these pieces of legislation or any of them that may be out there now? And again, I said we would mostly focus on ones that have passed, but this would be a case if there's something you're working on now or in the past. Has anyone here ever participated in this sort of advocacy along these lines? Okay, maybe in the future, maybe not. Again, we only have so much time to do so many things, but maybe it's something we ought to, yeah, thank you, Linda. And again, it's a time issue or an awareness issue, but maybe in the future, it's something to consider. Again, we're keeping in mind that there's always, yeah, Kathy, way too busy. That's the truth, right? It's a challenge, right? That is the challenge. But maybe the idea, of course, is just be aware of it. And again, recognizing that there can always be some legitimate wrangling about specifics. But again, this group and those that tune into our programming do have a general awareness and general idea or sense that these things are important. So if we were going to, not quite, okay, well, again, Delane, that's part of the challenge too, right? Getting our head around this, or what might make sense for a certain state, or what might make sense for the what the federal government should or shouldn't do. Yeah, Linda, maybe that's a challenge for a lot of us. We usually hear about it and start keeping up on it after, and that's just, for a lot of us, that's the case. Usually, obviously, as we know through some of these organizations or things that we learn through media, is that folks who have been impacted by this, right, generally are the ones who are strongly involved in the lobbying, or at least in the advocacy tied to this sort of thing, for sure. One that I want to mention here, this is more recent, and this is the Missing Persons and Unidentified Remains Act of 2019. You can see on this congress.gov. Yeah, it is easier to keep up on things at the state level. No doubt about that. And so the Missing Persons and Identified Remains Act of 2019 and the congress.gov link that I just sent out, you'll see, and if you can see on actions, that it was signed in the end of 2020 by the president, and that was the end of 2020. And so there's some summary there. And by the time it became public law, okay, and so you can see that this has to do with reporting of unidentified and missing persons. And you can see that it deals with grants and so forth pertaining to the involvement in, missing persons and identified remains. Here's one that's interesting. The bill requires any DNA reference sample that is received from a suspected biological family member and uploaded into the combined DNA index system to be used only for identifying missing persons and unidentified remains. And you can see that there's some other items. You can read that. So this is one that's fairly recent, for sure. And so you have that resource page there. I do think, though, again, back to what Kathy says and just this general idea, it's hard to keep up on all of them. Maybe one view is we focus on our own state in terms of what we can do. There's nothing wrong with that. So again, we can see, and so I pointed to an issue. I'm not taking a position on how any of this should be remedied, but we see some varying ages across states with Amber Alert. We also see, though, that states have other sorts of notification systems in place. We saw the Tennessee Act that modified the endangered notification. Yes, the DOE network is a great resource. I don't know off the top of my head its specific. NamUs has some presence, obviously, in governmental work, but the DOE network certainly is a resource. I don't know to what extent that has any grants or funding from governmental entities, but certainly that's a good resource, for sure. Obviously we talk about NamUs in terms of government, but I'm going to quickly, because and I'm aware of the DOE network. That is, it began, according to the DOEnetwork.org, began as a website in 1999, evolving into an informal volunteer organization in 2001, and then eventually into 501c3. So not knowing what their grants or so forth are, or donors, you can see that. Whereas with NamUs.gov, we have something that's more directly tied to the government. And we've talked about NamUs as a resource previously, and we know that that's a tremendous resource. But again, like I said earlier, the more that you get through these various episodes, the more I see so many different resources and organizations out there that are important. So, and maybe that's an issue, right, in terms of continuing to figure out ways legislatively to bolster the coordination of resources and awareness, although there is a lot of that. And of course, there are always going to be legitimate disputes about funding. But if you're prioritizing this stuff, then of course you can navigate those things in a civil way, again, which is our approach, civility. Any other issues? So we've kind of seen some variances at the state level, right? So if it's five, right, and Kathy, certainly you know a little bit about that, and so that has to be an exempt organization, and so I guess they're doing that sort of work and not directly tied, like NamUs would be to the government, right? Or more so tied to the government, although NamUs has partners and so forth, as we know. Any other issues? So, and again, any other issues that you see, just as you've known and as we think through these things tonight, that legislation should be considered? What sorts of ideas or practices should be considered for missing persons legislation going forward? Yeah, so you're saying, Delane, we need to think more about DNA identification, how that could be regulated in terms of IDing remains, and certainly, that's something that the act that the law, the legislation that I just mentioned had some mention of, but certainly there are probably some areas, if one were to look in terms of law enforcement and criminal justice, academic people and journalists and interested folks, I'm sure there'd be some discussion about IDing tied to DNA. Of course, again, I'm not a lawyer, but of course we're always navigating, right? Issues of constitutionality and how these laws are dealt with. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm not advocating for any specific interpretation here, but those are things to think about. But certainly DNA ID. Anyone else have any issues that might be relevant to legislation going forward as states and the federal government think about these issues? Most people, Linda, don't even give a thought to these sites or legislation until it directly offends them, and this affects them. My apologies. This actually gets into what our other guiding question was, right? How might we get folks or people more involved in these conversations? Again, notwithstanding legitimate agreements and disagreements, just get people to be aware of these things. Now, granted, we're busy. People are busy. Maybe it's best to focus on the state level mostly, but certainly federal legislation along these lines have been impactful. But yeah, it is true, right, Kathy? So many things in life until it affects us, and we do see with advocates for some of these that it has been folks who have been impacted by that. So, and even if it's not governmental action, even if it's just us literally, metaphorically, talking about these. Obviously, we're sharing resources here. Hopefully people who watch this video, follow some of these resources. National Missing Persons Days. I decided not to get into those too much tonight. I was aware of those, obviously, and I had been doing some reading about that in certain places across the country, or as mentioned by certain organizations. But yeah, how many people were really aware, unless you're really following sort of the broad discussion about missing purposes, how many people know about those Missing Persons Day? And I know there are people who I know at least one, and I know there are more guests and certainly audience members of Unfound who have been involved in advocacy at their state and or federal level for some sort of legislation pertaining to missing purposes. But yeah, it's interesting to see it's interesting to think about what folks ponder and think about on a daily basis. Let's talk about Suzanne's Law, right? That's one. And let me just put out a good resource. Maybe there should be more advertising. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, so there's some discussion about the use of NamUs out there. And so NamUs as a resource, and in terms of the ongoing use of NamUs does seem to be a legislative issue. Of course, there are other resources out there. That's one maybe we can keep on our horizon as we think about ideas and practices to follow for the future. So very important. So we do have Suzanne's Law. And so in 2003, and there's a couple references we have that deal with Suzanne's Law, but I'm back to Hope 4, the number 4, the missing.org. So in 2003, President Bush, right, the son, signed into law the Suzanne's Law. And so this gave a requirement to police to give notification to the National Crime Information Center when someone between 18 and 21 is reported missing, right? So now someone under 21 is considered a missing child, no longer under the age of 18. And certainly with these sorts of things, there's as this site mentions, right, there's some implementation and catch up that goes on. And so this was named, of course, for Suzanne Lyle, and that was a college student, university student in New York, New York State. There's also the Suzanne Lyle Campus Safety Act. And so in 2008, President Bush signed a bill that for pertaining to colleges and universities and the policies in terms of violent crime on campus, which then connected to other legislation pertaining to higher education. And so this gets into sort of college university life. And if you spend some time and looking at various discussions of some of these legislative references on .edu sites, college university sites, you'll see, of course, reference to aspects of this type of legislation in relation to other laws and policies that govern universities, depending on the university and so forth. But so of course, there's a broader awareness of issues of crime and violent crime on campuses. But of course, we're dealing with things that could pertain to either the prevention, let's hope, of missing persons, or unfortunately the having to deal with that, and then reporting that. So when you go to some FBI sites, and I won't necessarily share those links here, but when you see discussions of that NCIC missing person, unidentified person statistics through the years, you'll see a note there going and referencing the Crime Control Act of 1990, dealing with reporting and summarizing for the public. But then this act, and then just this is right from this FBI sites, the act was modified April 7, 2003 by Suzanne's Law that changed the age of mandatory missing person record entry from under 18 to under 21 years of age. And so again, this is the NCIC, National Crime Information Center's missing persons file. So that, again, you'll see that noted on various reporting on the FBI.gov when they're providing that. So you can see in terms of, obviously, the FBI is part of the federal government, and so they're having to follow this. And we do know that in terms of, for dealing with missing person situations, as well as, updating and disclosure to the public about these sorts of things in terms of real events and statistics. Two, it is important. I'm not a criminologist, but I recognize certainly the importance of the work of police and criminologists and lawyers and government people and so forth, and dealing with these statistics and dealing with trends and grappling with policy and, of course, policy debates. Okay. But, so that's significant. Suzanne's Law. And again, the Suzanne Lyle Campus Safety Act. Okay, so you have information on that. Someone here mentioned Suzanne's Law. Did anyone want to say anything more about that? Suzanne's Law. Let me look back and see who mentioned it. Linda, you mentioned Suzanne's Law. Anything else? Anything you'd like to mention, or did I cover what you know about it, or you have anything to add? Okay. So that's Suzanne's Law and the Suzanne Lyle Campus Safety Act. Yeah, thank you, Linda. I do. Okay, so if you're looking for some background too on Amber, and of course Amber is important, right? We like Amber Alerts. Well, let me rephrase that. We like the idea that there's a resource in place for Amber Alert. Yes, we do have the Silver Alert for missing seniors. That's something that should be mentioned. Okay, that is important. Of course, a lot of the legislation, and I think it was the police chiefs organization that I mentioned that emphasized this, that a lot of the legislation has been tied to children, but not everything in terms of public policy and resource allocation. State level, federal level, state level. Absolutely, Silver Alert, very important. Of course, for sure. Okay, I'm just sharing some of these resources on Amber. We don't have to get too deep into Amber, but it's good to know that in terms of as a framework and being impacted and in some ways furthered by legislation. Okay. We want to keep those references in the mix and keep that on our horizon. And I do have some things there for sure. Amber Alert. Okay, and while I'm going through here, anyone have anything you want to interject before I go on? I'm getting used to this. We were used to the Zoom meetings. Okay, now we're using this, and it has some good momentum for us. I think I'm used to it. Obviously, I don't. Ed gets a lot more folks, and that's great. So right now, I'm getting used to this. Working through the chat and being able to keep that conversation. If I need to do better, never be afraid to give us feedback. As always, if we're ever having any sound issues too, whatever, please let us know. We did mention the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006. Okay, and so let me just give you that legislation. Of course, we're familiar probably with the situation with Adam Walsh, but of course I have this congress.gov, right, recognizes the commitment of John and Reeve Walsh to the protection of children from child predators on the 25th anniversary of the abduction and murder of their son Adam. Of course, that was in 2006. And then there are other things involved with that. Let's see, establishes the Jacob Wetterling, Megan Nicole Conca, and Pam Lyncher sex offender registration and notification program, and so forth. There are a lot of particularities there. You can see if you go through that law in terms of federal criminal law enforcement, notification requirements, trying to protect children from violent predators. Obviously, here we're dealing with prevention issues as well as, activities and resources that are sort of on the go in a crisis situation. information and resources to ensure that children are not attacked or abused, protection, prevention, and obviously issues pertaining to immigration, child pornography, community safety, sort of constructive safety and activity programs and so forth. And so you can see that. Has anyone in the past maybe kept up? When I hear Code Adam in the store, I go into instant search mode. Obviously, again, Code Adam, that we're dealing with, again, as we mentioned, inside built public buildings, right? And so that's something it's important. And we know just through experience, you don't have to be deeply into missing persons cases or any sort of expert, just to remember from experience, being in a department store or some other sort of building, and, a kid gets lost and, there's an announcement. I mean, this goes back, some parents back in the day, have code words and sort of protocols with children. And, little kids are going to be kids. They're going to get lost. Obviously, don't talk to strangers. It seems basic, but it's important. But yeah, the Code Adam, right? How do we have protocols when we're in the store or some sort of public building? That's important for sure. So, yep, child missing in the store. And again, you can usually search if you just do some reading out there on Code Adam. And again, we're dealing with maybe things that at the state level might vary from state to state. Although with some of the federal laws, federal legislation, again, some of it is pertaining to mandates, in terms of or laws with regard to federal government. Some provides funding, grants, guidelines, and so forth. In terms of resources, again, I've sent two things tonight that kind of give some overview for sure. In terms of federal law. One, and we've kind of been, let's see here, it was named Adam Walsh, right? So the 6-year-old son of John Walsh, right? He was taken from a Sears department store in Florida in 1981 and was later found murdered, right? So that's that same John Walsh, Adam Walsh, right? Tied to that 2006 act. We've talked about some impact of some of these pieces of legislation. There are processes for this. Generally, it mirrors on the state level what happens at the federal level in terms of legislation going through, state legislative body or bodies, and then going to the desk of the governor, their advocates and lobbyists. Similar process at the federal level. Certainly, we do see with some of these pieces of legislation similar ideas that sometimes happen at the state level in terms of momentum to the federal, and then the other way too, right? Whether that's the state government coordinating with something federally or dealing with something in their own way, parallel to and or above and beyond what's being done at the federal level. So that's part of the American way, so to speak. On one hand, states have to deal with what's best for them at the state level. However, when we're dealing with something like missing persons, and just through some of the reading, and I'm not going to mention any specific references here, you'll see that through some of the materials that we looked at. Obviously, we know just through civic knowledge, when there's a crossing of state lines, and it was some of the earlier legislation. Obviously, the federal government can get involved, and certainly there's been more definitive views and action on that with regard to these pieces of legislation. And so, where should our focus be? That's something that you have to work out and think about what you're interested in. One question that someone had asked outside of this, before this, was, to what extent should all these things that happen at the state law go national? I mean, that's an open question. I think there's probably some common ground as to things that are important. Of course, there's just a legitimate legal, political differences that exist across the state. Of course, you do have people and organizations that are advocating in various, in a particular area or in various areas. One thing, and I've cited two and sent links for two areas, list articles that have sort of a list of sort of significant pieces of legislation. I will say that some of the other websites that we usually use certainly have references to specific pieces of legislation at the federal or state level. Maybe the media, well, there might be, and I certainly am going to continue the search. Also, maybe some EDUs have this already. Maybe there needs to be more. Maybe this is something that some of us could do on our own. Again, we're back to the discussion about crowdsourcing. Maybe there could be better, more readily accessible, comprehensive resources out there. With that, again, we've located some credible sources that lists key legislation historically and in a contemporary way. But, media push, right? This was something that Natasha mentioned. Media push, resources for media. Obviously, we've looked at various media, journalistic resources that are relevant to missing persons cases in general, crime in general. To what extent could the idea of legislative awareness be part of that? That's an open question. I don't know. Let's talk a bit about that. Does anyone want to? I know we did have a little conversation tonight about sort of being aware about the legislation and missing persons days and so forth. But do we have any ways in which we think we should maybe put together or promote some resources just to make sure that people are aware of this, whether it's media or just everyday people in our local communities or whatever? I know someone mentioned advertising. Certainly advertising in a paid way requires resources, but there's a lot we can do, without paid advertising in terms of making people aware of this. Hopefully by watching this episode, if you're watching this episode, please continue to study this material and think through it and study and share some of these resources for sure. I want to also go to and by the way, here is and this is on hopeforthemissing.org, hope for the number 4, themissing.org. Here's another overview. This is the actual act itself. You can get this on the U.S. government sites too, but that's the actual Walsh Act, the actual act itself. Government could insert in their mailings from DMV, legislators, etc. Yeah, and there is obviously politicians rightly on these things, we would say, trumpet what they do. But yeah, there probably could be more of that in terms of making people specifically aware. Of course, in this age, and of course we all get busy, those resources are out there if we kind of hunt them down and coordinate them. But yeah, maybe they could be more proactive in the governmental publications in terms of that. Here's the Protect Act, right? We mentioned the Protect Act. I'm going to put that one out there. That's the act itself. Yeah, we're back to prevention, and that's a theme we're never going to lose on this program. Notwithstanding any legislation, although legislation is important, we are about prevention, always back to the basics, right? We talk about studying missing persons cases and trying to deal with that discourse about solving them, but we want to prevent. Yeah, the resources list, more resources, including the legislation, but not exclusively. Kathy, Linda, of course. Let me see, I want to just mention a few more. 1993, and I'm back to hopeforthemissing.org, the number 4 on their article that has significant measures enacted to assist children at risk. I've sent this link out already. 1990, passage of the National Child Search Assistance Act. Okay. 2000, passage of the Child Abuse Prevention and Enforcement Act, known as Jennifer's Law, and so forth. Right. So you have that link already, for sure. Anyone else have any pieces of legislation they want to discuss? Or any other ideas for raising awareness? Because the reality is, people kind of have to navigate on their own, what they want to advocate for politically. Again, we all have sort of the general idea that we think this is important, but people have to navigate where they want to go on that. But the idea of being aware of the legislation that has passed, that's important because it's passed. How those laws pertain, what they do, and yeah, back to the brass tacks of prevention. And when we're in situations where we are dealing with a missing person, what are the resources available? For sure. These are some great ideas for expanding the conversation. So thank you for that. Again, as I mentioned, Linda, I can't say I've ever seen information on how to get involved with the organizations anywhere ever. Now, this is one thing, as I mentioned. So Kathy, in California, there's no waiting period to report a missing person. And so with some of this, with pieces of legislation that we've discussed, obviously there was a push from the federal government to expedite, and particularly as you shift that age upwards to under 21, there's a timeliness involved, and some of this, of course, dealt with at the various state levels. That seems to make sense, right, Kathy? Why would you want a waiting period to report a missing person? And Kathy, are you saying is notwithstanding age, there's no waiting period? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, that seems to be the case. And of course, again, study what goes on in your own state. I'm going to keep up on some of these things. I've been diving into this because of this episode. I knew a little bit about this and that. Thank you, Kathy. Yes. But when Natasha suggested this episode, it's like, yeah, that's a great idea. We had the historical overview last time, and then this. We're certainly going to keep on this. Back to organizations. Again, for this episode and others, I continue to find more organizations credible, some of which we've discussed, and those organizations have many resources. I do get the sense that we might have an episode where we're going to do an organizational overview. It's not just going to be about they have wonderful resources and they have good web resources, but maybe we ought to focus more on what they do specifically. That will, in some ways, reinforce for us or review some resources that we talked about. There's some others that would be good to know about nationally, maybe regionally, maybe at the state level. And so that's something that we're going to consider in the future for an episode idea, for sure. As always, we've covered a lot of material tonight. Excited about that, and some important pieces of legislation. Certainly, it's not all inclusive. Again, at the state level, I think as we recognize, there are a lot of them. Get to know what's going on in your state. We've looked at some examples. We've talked about some key pieces of federal legislation. This is something that has to stay on our horizon. We've talked about some ways of raising awareness, about these. I think some folks may hear about a few of these, but maybe don't know the scope to which these are out there. We've gotten some good discussion here. As always, before we wind down, is there anything that anyone else would like to add in terms of anything we discussed tonight? Again, the resources we've shared, please follow those links and keep those links. Those are real-time resources for us. Please, as you study these are resources that could be helpful in your conversations and so forth with others. So, as always, appreciate greatly the work of the think tank folks in these discussions. At some point, Natasha and Ed push these to a public status, and we're getting views, and we are, I think, achieving our aims of getting some of these discussions out there. If you continue to have feedback about how things are going, content or format or technical, please share that. If you have any ideas for episodes, please share that. As always, we appreciate what you're doing in the think tank. If you're watching this, once it is publicized, don't forget the unfoundpodcast.com. Lots of important resources on there. Please share that. Please utilize that website. Please share that website. And thank you to everyone. Again, as I always say, someone out there knows something or knows someone who knows something. Keep up the good work. Thanks, folks. This again concludes Unfound on the Ground number 12, an overview of missing persons legislation. Thank you.